Modern philosophy began with René Descartes. He is essentially the beginning, a pretty strict beginning of the philosophical tradition which we call modern philosophy. Before him there was scholastic philosophy, which itself is defined by someone called Thomas Aquinas. And his project was to synthesize Aristotle and Christian philosophy. So if we just take a very brief history of Western philosophy, we have the Greeks. Pre-Socratics come up to Socrates. Socrates' pupil Plato creates his theory of forms, and at least if we follow Nietzsche's description, that gives rise to the impetus for the Christian worldview, where we create a different world which is more real and which this whole world of appearance is subservient to. That's the world of God. And then up until Thomas Aquinas, some 2,000 years later, or 1,500 years later, the Christian worldview was essentially believed, Christian and Platonic worldview. But Thomas Aquinas got his hands on some Aristotle, which had been not as popularly read as Plato, and he tried to synthesize what he saw in Aristotle with his Christian theology, and what he created was a school which was then called scholasticism. And the scholastic philosophers were essentially all there was in philosophy in the West up until Descartes. So we have Descartes, and what he's considered as being is a rationalist. And the reason he is considered that way is because he began his philosophical endeavor by looking into his mind and looking into see if he could rationally prove anything internally. And that's distinguished from the empiricists, who take as their starting point the external world. Both, of course, make assumptions. Descartes made an assumption. His most famous phrase was, "I think, therefore I am." But there are a lot of assumptions in the phrase, "I think, therefore I am." You know, the fact that there has to be an I which thinks is one that I latch onto as being dubious. Then it almost has to be an I which thinks. That's a presumption. So we presume that when we look into our minds, we can find something solid. I think that relies on some presumptions that Descartes is guilty of. But then the empiricists, of course, rely on assumptions. First of all, that there is an external world, and that it's not merely a representation of it's not merely something that's mental. We have to assume that there's an external world before we can even get started with empiricism. So we start with Descartes, and he inaugurates the rationalist tradition. So the next great figure in that tradition is Spinoza. And Spinoza, it was similar to Descartes, although what Descartes did was he famously split the mind from the body. He says, "I think, therefore I am. I know that my mind exists." And then he eventually tried to prove that the world exists, rather than just being something that appears to him in his mind. Spinoza does the same process, where he has to unify the mind and the external world, but for Spinoza, he does it by he describes the mind and the body as being two manifestations of one thing. So there's a sort of overwhelming, underwriting real world that isn't mental or physical, but which manifests itself in mental and physical ways. And that leads up to Leibniz, which I will admit I don't understand as well, but he has a notion called a monad, where it's kind of like an atomistic view of the world, but the monads are... let's actually put the monads thing on hold, because I don't think I can do it justice, but let's take a look down the other end of the spectrum, beginning with Descartes, which is the empiricist side, and that begins with John Locke. One of the things that John Locke does is he says he distinguishes between primary and secondary qualities. So we're still in this tradition of trying to figure out how clearly the things that we think of in our head represent the things in the world. And what John Locke says is that, supposing when I see an apple, I see it as red. It's very possible that in your experience, when you see that same apple, you see a color and you call that color red. But it may well be that what's happening in your mind is a perception of green. But if we both call that the same color, we'll never know the difference. So that is a secondary quality in John Locke's framework, and it's distinguished from a primary quality, which is to say the shape of the apple. Because if you see an apple and I see a banana, we're going to be able to find it out eventually that we're not seeing the same thing, because I'm going to treat this thing like a banana and you're going to treat it like an apple. And the way you treat those things is different. I'm going to start trying to peel it. And if you're seeing it as an apple and you start seeing me peel it, it's just not going to make sense. So that's a different kind of world perception. Then we get to Berkeley, and eventually through to Hume. And what both Berkeley and Hume attempted to do was to organize our view of our senses and see if our senses accurately reflect the world, then why are our senses prone to contradicting each other? Because the world can't contradict itself. So I can't actually remember if this was Berkeley or Hume who made this analogy, but it's the analogy of these 3 pots of water. So on the left hand, we have a warm pot of water, and on the right hand, we have a cold pot of water, and in the center, we have a room temperature pot of water. And we sit our hands left in the warm one and right in the cold one for a while until we get used to it, and then we take our hands out and place them both in the center water pot, which is at room temperature. And to our left hand, which has been in the warm water, it feels cold. But to our right hand, which has been in the hot water, it feels... been in the cold water, it feels warm. So the point being made here is that if our senses accurately reflect the world, then what are we to conclude about the temperature of the water in the middle pot? Is it hot or is it cold? So clearly, it can't be both, because that would be a contradiction. It doesn't even make sense. So the point there is that our senses aren't accurately reflecting the world to us. We have to use reason to get at reality. The senses don't reflect it perfectly. So that takes us from Hume, and we get to Kant then. And Kant considered himself to be synthesizing all of the people in the modern philosophical tradition that had come before him. And what he did was he took a lot of the ideas of what we might have about the external world, and he claimed that we actually come with conditions by which we interpret the world. So this can really only make sense if I give an example. So for instance, what he says is that our idea of space isn't something that exists in our minds when we're born, but it also isn't something that we learn by experience. It is rather a conditioning feature of consciousness. In order to perceive the world, it has to be organized in space. That's a condition for our experience. So it doesn't actually reflect the nature of the world. It just reflects our apparatus, our sensory and cognitive apparatus for getting towards the world. So Kant actually did that in quite a lot of ways. He separated the world into the phenomenal world and the noumenal world. And the phenomenal world is that of appearance, and the noumenal world is the external world, the God's eye view of the world. And what Kant concludes is that we just aren't able to get at the noumenal world, because the whole world which we experience, the phenomenal world, we can't get outside of the conditions. So he says that space is merely a function of the mind. It's an organizing function of the mind that organizes our experience. The experience wouldn't even be possible without it, but that it doesn't reflect reality. And then time is another one of those conditioning qualities. And then we end up with a world where we say, okay, so in the noumenal world, there is no space and there is no time. And we get to a stage where this whole idea of the noumenal world kind of collapses. It almost has no content. So Kant felt that he had solved the problem and he'd unified the two ends of the tradition, but many of the people which followed him found his account of the external world to be very dissatisfying. And the 2 superstars which immediately followed from him or in the German tradition, and since Kant, philosophy was largely in the German tradition until the positivists came along in England. And those two superstars are on the one hand Hegel, and on the other Schopenhauer. So we'll take a look at Hegel. What he looked at the Kantian view, where he says, okay, we have the phenomenal world and we have the noumenal world, but if we take Kant's word for it, then the noumenal world is something which we can never actually access. And for that reason, Hegel decided that we may as well go about philosophy without any concern for this noumenal world, and that we ought to look more into the world of appearance and see what we can find out in the organizational attitude. So when we're Hegel, the starting point for his philosophy, we're trying to understand reality. It's not that we're trying to get further out there into the world. It's that we're trying to develop our organizational systems better. So that the truth is really more a matter of organizing perceptions of the world. It's not about finding the actual world out there. And that puts Hegel in a state where he says, okay, we don't have an external world out there which we can verify any of our claims about. So when we speak about truth, what we're really talking about is consensus, essentially. We're talking about some things which are so agreed upon that we take them as granted. And for Hegel, that what we consider, if we get into larger and larger groups, if we can all get a larger consensus, then that demonstrates that whatever belief is believed by the consensus, the larger the consensus is, the more validity that belief has, because it's stood the test of passing each individual in the groups, in the state, I might say. It's passed all of their accounting of truth. So Hegel's idea, therefore, was that the state, being the sum of all of the individuals, is the perfect representation of the truth. The state, because it is the consensus of the people, it is the closest thing that we can get to when it comes to describing truth, if we can't actually verify anything against an external world. And of course, then Hegel went on to say that as time goes on, our beliefs about the world are confronted by contradictions which we find in the world, and that it's by taking what we believe and then looking straight at the thing that contradicts it and bringing them into contact with each other, and then throwing aside both our old belief and what we see that's new, and trying to form a new synthesis of those two things, and then that becomes the new paradigm. So that's Hegel's attitude, where the state is the perfect manifestation of the idea of truth, and that it progresses through history. Now let's distinguish that from Schopenhauer, who at the same time he had another type of idealism. Hegel, of course, he just discarded the noumenal world, whereas what Schopenhauer focused on was his most famous work, or series of works, because it's in volumes, is The World as Will and Idea. And essentially what he argues in that is that the world that we perceive outside is generated by our passions. So we have will, we have passion, and the nature of a passion is to project out into the world. It's like this idea of the subject and the object. You know, we all understand that our perception of the world is always separated into subjects and objects, because that's just built into our language. So that affects our perception of the world, and it kind of underlies, say, cause and effect, because there's a subject which is the cause, and there's an object which is the effect. So we have this intuition for subject and object distinction that's so fundamental to our thinking, because it's built right into our language. So Schopenhauer says, okay, we have these passions, we are subjects, and the nature of a passion is to project itself into the world. And then what Schopenhauer concluded from this was that the whole image of the world which we have is just a conglomeration of projections generated by our passions. So then the world becomes will and idea, because the idea is that by which we organize our wills, so that we can actually, so we project a whole lot of different inconsistent things out into the world, and we use our mind to organize those in a coherent way. At the same time, the mind, the intellect, which organizes those things, is itself a passion. It's just a different kind, and it's the kind of passion which desires to be the executive and desires to organize the other passions. So, from that, Schopenhauer concluded that the only person who can really understand reality is a genius, because what the genius is someone who is so possessed of a powerful intellectual will that it has the strength to dominate all of the other wills. And it's only if it has that predominance that it's able to attain the image of reality. So you kind of consider that similar to Freud's reality function as opposed to the libido, where the libido projects onto the world meanings and desires, but the reality function checks those. So what Schopenhauer would say is that really the reality function is something that can only be possessed by a genius, because otherwise it will just be the tool of the passions. So if you're not a genius, you might have a sexual passion or a passion for power, or some kind of, maybe if you just want to get some nice food from different places, whatever it is, whatever your passion is, unless you're a genius, the intellectual passion will simply be a tool of the lower passions. The intellectual passion will be a way of organizing the world so that you can satisfy your other passions, rather than taking over itself as a passion. So for Schopenhauer, only the genius can make the reality function subservient to the libido. Now, I just want to finish with bringing Hegel and Schopenhauer. I'm going to end with the immediate successor of each of those philosophers. So for Hegel, the successor was Marx. And what he did with Hegel was he saw that Hegel had this idea that, okay, we're throwing out the truth is consensus, and that truth changes with history. And the idea is that as we move forward and forward and forward and forward, this idea of truth represented by the state, Hegel, it gets more and more perfect. And there's a singularity at the end of this tunnel where the state is a perfect, coherent whole. And that's what he considers that's Hegel's utopia. But Marx thinks that the things which cause the change in society are not ideas, as Hegel thought. Hegel thought that society progressed because there was consensus among individuals, and that consensus is the definition of the truth in Hegel. But then that truth is run up against something which contradicts it. Now, that might be something that happens in the world which contradicts it, or it might be another group of people which contradict it, but nonetheless, this state image representation of the truth runs into its contradiction. And by doing so, a new paradigm is formed, which is a synthesis of two different paradigms. Marx didn't think that it was ideas which were the defining milestones as history progresses, although he did think that history progressed and at the end of the tunnel was a utopia. Marx simply thought that rather than ideas being the thing which changes, it's material economic conditions. So he would say, this ancient Greek attitude where we had a whole lot of slaves, that worked for a bit, but then eventually the slaves got pretty sick of it, and just overthrew the aristocrats, and we got Christianity. So you might say that the next thing forward is some kind of synthesis. Of course, we're getting a little bit too Hegel, because when I talk about Christianity, it seems more like an idea, but the Industrial Revolution, for instance, is a situation wherein that's a contradiction to the feudalistic attitude, because the feudalistic attitude had people living in the little charmed circle of their lord, and they didn't really go around. They didn't travel between different lorded areas. I don't know what you call those, kingships, whatever, little feudal areas. They didn't move between them because you had to demonstrate allegiance to your lord for him to reward you in any way. But of course, once the industrial machine began, what happened was movement became much more necessary, because obviously if I want to mass produce a product, I might need to get one material from the top of England and another material from the bottom, and I have to move between the two areas before I can actually make this product. So that contradicted the feudalistic economic system. And what Marx would say is that what we need now is the synthesis of those two systems. So the economic system might be pure capitalism, and of course, we did eventually run into some kind of synthesis where we have like state capitalism. We have state. We have a government that is organized, but it organizes mostly the economy, and we live through the economy. Unlike before, we lived through the feudal system. And Marx would argue that we're coming to a point where the internal contradictions of the mechanical worldview are now running up against a different problem, which is the problem of the lower classes. And of course, for Marx, the lower classes are inevitable under a capitalist system, and he thinks that the real synthesis between those two economic standards is communism. And Marx's communism isn't a state communism; it's a to each. What is the phrase? To each. What is necessary, and from each what he can, something like that. But it suggests that we're all going to live voluntarily communist. But there are stages towards that, but that the perfect system, where there are no more contradictions, is that of communism. And where there is no state, we just do it voluntarily. And the reason I'm going to stop there is because we've kind of stopped with the modern philosophy tradition, and we're now moving into the 20th century tradition, which can be distinguished in many ways. But it also gets far too complex. The picture is quite simple before we get to the 20th century. At least a simple picture can be drawn. I don't think it's final. So I'll just finish on how Nietzsche emerged from Schopenhauer, because Nietzsche even says himself that Schopenhauer was one of his primary influences. And what happens is that Nietzsche takes Schopenhauer's idea of the world as will an idea, and he takes it even further. So he says, the world is will, the world is out there, constructed based on my passions. So I describe my idea of the world. That's all subservient to my passions. Nietzsche, though, doesn't have Schopenhauer's optimism that the genius would be able to access reality. In fact, Nietzsche really is the one that makes the realization that the intellect is itself just a passion. So if we are to make all of our other passions subservient to the intellectual one, we actually haven't gotten out of the command of the passions. We're just simply in the command of one in particular. And that is not only not an accomplishment, but it's actually a failure, because we've significantly divided our own soul into a whole lot of passions which we consider to be unacceptable, and the one which we consider to be acceptable, which is that of the intellect. And to Nietzsche, this kind of just reflects the Platonic idea of subsuming everything underneath this world of perfect forms, and it's just a consequence and manifestation of Christianity. So then Nietzsche takes the Schopenhauerian idea of this world of will and ideas, and he says, ultimately, if we think about the expression of passions, what's happening there is that passions have a will to expression, and he calls that expression, that will to expression, the will to power, and sort of the will to health. You might think of it as they want to get out there. They want to get out there, get their hooks into the world, and move forward, grow, express themselves. There's an entelechy to the passions, you might say. It's like an entelechy is what the Greeks called the drive of the acorn to become a tree. And what Nietzsche might say is that the drive of lust is to become something, to become a magnificent form of lust. And there's a drive of hunger to become sophisticated, tasteful hunger, And the same with the intellect. There's just a desire there. So what Nietzsche ultimately claims is that there is a path set forth by the passions, and that what we need to do is we need to aim towards a world in which the passions are able to be brought into harmony with one another, and to achieve the greatest state of realization, which they might. And that's really where we end up with Nietzsche. And in that whole system, I'll say that I'm obviously biased towards Nietzsche. If you've seen my previous videos, he's kind of something I'm obsessed with. But I think Nietzsche, he defined this new modern period. I mean, he did make a prediction that the next 100, 200 years after his death would be defined by unbelievable mass suffering and death and ideology, and the attempt to fill the God-shaped hole in our souls. And I do feel that even right now we're experiencing yet another wave of this desperate attempt to fill that hole. It happened with World War I. We all know that World War One was what, bored people wanting to flex their guns. Really, what happened there is that no one could, deep down, we felt an uncertainty about. Felt that the ground had floor had fallen from beneath us. And the reason we felt that way is because God was dead. And the First World War was a reaction to that. We just wanted to stir ourselves up so that we could forget it. And then we said, lest we forget never again. And we did it again 15 years later. And then we did it again with the Cold War. And then certainly America's been doing it last century over and over again 30 times. And then now we're doing it, I would say, again with this whole world situation we're in. I'm seeing quite clearly that there is a significant swath of people who have a God-shaped hole in their soul and they're trying to fill it with the state or with, you might say, not simply the state, but also with worries. We got ourselves into World War One just to have something to occupy us. And I think in a large degree we've got ourselves in the situation we're in just to distract us. And just goes to show that if we're willing to do what we're doing right now, that the thing which we're running from, to stare into this abyss which Nietzsche stared into, it's truly terrifying because it's giving us this.